people are joining. Simon, do you think we should start?
Why not? Or should we wait maybe?
We just wait for another minute? Yes.
Yeah, because there are still people
joining now. Yeah.
Joining now. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we can start.
All right.
Cool. What do you think?
Right. Okay, let's start.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'll just open a thing. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Good evening and good morning to some of you in the other jurisdictions. Welcome to our webinar. We have an opening statement by the IPBA president, Mr. Jack Lee. And then after that, we'll also let Simon just talk to you a little bit about the topic of our webinar. Mr. Lee?
Dear distinguished guests and colleagues, I thank IPBA officers for organizing this timely seminar, taking place under the devastating impact brought out by COVID-19. I appreciate the joint efforts and collaborations from all members and officers working for IPBA during such a difficult time. Countries around the world have passed stimulus packages to address the economic recession and pandemic. The distribution of COVID-19 rescue funds devoted to pandemic relief represents an unprecedented program integrated challenge. Not only is the relief large, but these programs have unique characteristics that make it challenging to ensure and achieve intended results. For example, in the United States, 2.9 trillion US dollars, with officers are being asked to stand up processes, taking in applications and get money out the door as soon as possible, but to also minimize errors. However, unlike fraud, improper payments could be unintentional due to issues in progress. $49 billion US dollars was exhausted in the first 13 days as companies scrambled to get the loans. And there were reports of large corporations obtaining large loans while many smaller businesses came away empty-handed. Congress then added an additional $320 billion US dollars in funding for the program. An additional $6.8 billion US dollars was announced to fund community development financial institutions, CDFI, to primarily support undeserved low-income areas. How should governments approach this unprecedented challenge of program integrity? And how can they achieve the goal of fast and accurate disbursements with clear accountability for impact? Today, this panel will address the specific stimulus plans enacted in Hong Kong SAR of China, Malaysia, India, Singapore, United Kingdom, and Switzerland, with a focus on best compliance practice for companies and financial institutions, the types of fraud and abuse of the program each country is seeing, and the government's approach to investigating and prosecuting those abuses. Ladies and gentlemen, before closing my words, I would like to invite you to Shanghai Annual Media Conference on April 18 to April 21st this year by on-site plus online model. And I will surely bring you an unforgettable event in Shanghai. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. And hi, everybody. This was a very good introduction. And we just spoke before this session and thought it's crazy. It's been a year now that all of us have been in lockdowns, some of us continuously, and some of us on and off. In Switzerland, we are still in lockdown, but slowly opening. And if we think what happened a year ago, we remember that countries around the world have passed extraordinary stimulus packages to address the economic recession caused by COVID-19 and to help those affected by the pandemic. Billions of dollars have been distributed in various forms. But while the bulk of spending had not yet reached those in need, there had already been concerns about fraud. Fraud, waste, abuse, or mismanagement of government funds erodes the public's trust in the government and reduces the support that countless individuals and businesses need in these difficult times. The size and scope of states' response to the economic crisis triggered by COVID-19 made some amount of criminal activity inevitable. Help was distributed quickly and sometimes, and so is the case in Switzerland, without controls or checks. This made many of these programs an easy target for criminals. With a year having passed, the magnitude of this fraud is now coming into view, and it appears that criminals stole billions of dollars of money intended to benefit firms and families affected by the economic dislocation. Distributing the money was quick, but making corrections afterwards is hard work. Nonetheless, this must be done. Mistakes must be corrected. Cases of abuse must be pursued in the spirit of fair and equal treatment on which taxpayers and recipients must be able to rely. And as mentioned before, we have various jurisdictions today contributing to this panel, and we will look into 6 jurisdictions and what kind of help they released, and what are the current issues that these jurisdictions face in terms of fraud cases and how they handle it. So Koen is now presenting the panelists. Over to you, Koen.
Hi, yes, before we go on to talk about the aids and the abuses that we have, so I'll just do a quick introduction of all the panelists in no particular order. Sean, I'll just start with Sean. Sean is the Asia Head of Investigation and White Collar Defense and a partner in the litigation department of Paul Hastings. He has offices both in Hong Kong and in mainland China, and he leads on matters across the Asia Pacific region. He represents the world's largest multinational corporations in high-stake investigations and compliance reviews. As a dual practicing attorney, Sean also advises on FCPA and UK Bribery Act. Hi, Sean. Can wave at us.
Thanks very much.
Next, we have Abraham Verghese. Abraham is the founder and managing partner of Providence Law Asia Limited, a boutique international arbitration and litigation practice. He has over 20 years of experience in contentious work, both in Singapore, as well as working with foreign lawyers. In addition to his numerous awards and distinctions, I should highlight that Abraham has been named as the Singapore Managing Partner of the Year, and he was also recently made a senior counsel, which is Singapore's equivalent recognition to a QC, a Queen's Counsel. Hi, Abraham.
Thanks very much, Koen.
Okay, next, again, in no particular order, Anush Barry. Anush is a partner in Shadu Amachan Mangadesh Dispute Resolution and White Collar Defense Group. Anush practices across all major forums with a focus on commercial disputes before the Supreme Court of India. Anush has advised clients on investigations and court matters arising out of investigations carried out by a federal anti-corruption agency in India. His work involves assisting clients in all aspects of investigation, guiding defense strategy and representation before courts, as well as in investigations before the regulatory and government bodies. Welcome, Anush.
Hi everyone. Thank you.
Okay, Roger. Roger is, of course, the past chair of this Anti-Corruption and Rule of Law Committee. Roger is a partner in Clifford Chance London, and he specializes in regulatory enforcement proceedings, litigation, arbitration, ADR, and insolvency work. He's admitted to practice both in the UK as well as in Hong Kong. I'm sure in his long years of practice, he would have come across all forms of abuse and nefarious schemes that he can share with us later. Welcome, Roger. Okay, those are our 4 panelists. Simone is the present chair of this Anti-Corruption and Rule of Law Committee. She's a co-moderator of this session with myself. She will also be sharing her thoughts on this topic on the situation in Switzerland. Simone is a partner in La Leaf's litigation team based in Zurich. She specializes in complex domestic and cross-border proceedings and investigations, including fraud and white-collar crime, asset recovery, international mutual assistance in criminal and tax matters, and in international sanctions. She also advises clients on conducting investigations into harassment, allegations like the Me Too developments, business and human rights and ESG-related disputes. Hi, Simone. Okay. And I am from Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, in Screen. I'm partner in the disputes division in Screen. I co-head the compliance group in my firm. I think that's enough. Let's move on to the presentation. Each of the panelists will give you a brief outline of the schemes that they have in their jurisdiction so that we can see where we are, what we are looking at. We will start with Simone.
Have to unmute. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so as everybody maybe knows, Switzerland is a rich country, so it has been quite generous with helping companies, but also the population. And I think the biggest bulk of the program was a bridging loan program for small and medium-sized enterprises, which is worth 40 billion Swiss francs. So that would be maybe 35 billion US dollars. And affected companies could apply for a maximum of 10% of their annual turnover, but no more than 20 million, but that's quite good already. And credits given by the banks of the companies of up to 500,000 were fully secured by the Confederation with 0% interests. And credits exceeding 500,000 Swiss francs were secured by the Confederation to 85% of the value with 0.5 interest. So quite interesting. In terms of distribution, so 17 billion have been distributed as of February 2021, which is a total of 137,670 bridging loans in total. And what is quite interesting about this program is that there were no checks or controls. So as a company, you could turn up at your usual bank and apply for a credit and show your annual turnover, and so the credits were usually granted with very little control. And I think I will come to that afterwards. Obviously, the government chose to do so because the goal was to help quickly versus a long bureaucratic process. Okay, next. Yeah, next. I think that's still the same. Yeah, and there was also further aid, just a few examples. There was compensation for short time work. That means if a company was no longer able to occupy their employees at full time, they could apply for short time work. So for instance, an employee working only 20% of the usual time and would be paid for the remainder, and this was to avoid companies from laying off employees. So that means these people still continued to be employed, but would get the same salary as before, and the balance would be paid by the Confederation. There were also contributions à fonds perdu for non-profit sport organizations in an amount of 50 million francs, and emergency aid and compensation in the cultural sector. You can imagine that this sector has suffered a lot because there haven't been any cultural events since almost a year, and also compensation for loss of earnings, for example, for parents with children in need of care, because the schools have also been closed for a limited amount of time in Switzerland, and parents who couldn't go to work for this reason could apply for compensation. And there was also compensation for individuals who couldn't work because they were in quarantined or self-employed, in a total of 3 billion Swiss francs, so maybe 2.5 billion US dollars. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, maybe Abraham, you can let us know about Singapore.
Thank you very much, Koen. Good evening or good morning, everyone who's attending. The Singapore experience has been a very interesting one. It was a whole of government response to rapidly provide relief and deploy aid at the level of individuals and also at the level of companies. And to a certain extent, at the level of sectors, which was very targeted. This was something that Singapore is able to do because, like Switzerland, it's a relatively small country and it's relatively affluent. And so it was able to put together packages very, very quickly as soon as the what we call circuit breaker initiatives were put in place. Now, looking first at the reliefs that was provided at the individual level, you will see there broadly 4 different types of reliefs that were presented. I'm not going to go into any of them in great detail, but I just like to emphasize, if you look at the first one, the COVID Relief Recovery Grant, the CRG, which started in January 2021 to present. It was to provide financial support to middle and lower income households that were experiencing involuntary unemployment or income loss due to the pandemic. And very little needed to be shown to qualify for this. Some paperwork to prove loss of income or loss of employment, and some proof of attempts at searching for a new job or attempts at retaining would have sufficed to qualify you for these aids. The second form of relief was called the Temporary Relief Fund, which got deployed in April 2020, just within a month of the lockdown's beginning in Singapore. That constituted a one-off $500 cash payment for citizens and permanent residents who were 16 years and above, who experienced temporary unemployment or income loss for at least 3 consecutive months. Then we had the Self-Employed Income Relief Scheme, SIRES, which went on for 9 months last year, 3 quarterly payments of 3,000 or more for Singaporeans earning a net trade income of less than 100,000 and who did not own more than 1 property and whose property didn't have an annual value of more than $21,000. And finally, we have the COVID-19 support grant, which was again upfront cash payments of up to $500 for Singaporeans or permanent residents who were experiencing involuntary unemployment or job loss for 3 consecutive months. So that were the immediate reliefs that were provided at the individual level. And then we had at company level job support scheme. This was quite a substantial exercise on the part of the government, paying employers up to 75% of their local employee wages for the first $4,600 of their salaries monthly that they earned between the time April and May 2020, and then varying levels of support for different sectors in the months thereafter. And as you know, Singapore is a hub for transportation, both air and shipping. And the air sector was particularly badly hit. Changi Airport became a ghost town for a substantial period of time. 90% of our national carriers, airplanes had been grounded. And there were the consequential knock-on effects in hospitality, F&B, and so on and so forth, entertainment, arts industries. So there were very many targeted reliefs provided on a sectoral basis, which proved to be very, very effective. Next slide, please. This slide gives you a sense of the enormity of the aid that was rolled out by the Singapore government. These numbers are that much more impressive when you consider that the population of Singapore is just about 6 million people. So on a per capita basis, these are quite substantial rollout of grants and financial aids. As I was mentioning, you can see the aviation sector, top right column, were one of the biggest recipients of government aid, $350 million under the Enhanced Aviation Support Package. The other industries that were being uplifted by the government were our infrastructure and construction industry. Some of you may have heard Singapore experienced at one period very stark and high numbers of COVID infection cases, and this was happening in our foreign worker communities who were housed in close quarter dormitory arrangements. And so this proved to be a huge issue that we have had to deal with, and there were separate financial assistance provided both to the individuals and companies in the construction sector affected by this large number of foreign worker support that had become either disabled or unable to continue functioning in the normal way because of these high infection levels. So all in all, you can see about $100 billion were deployed within a period of months after COVID struck. Singapore, as you know, has a very healthy GDP situation, and we've usually very reluctant to draw on our national reserves. But on the occasion of COVID, I think the government pulled out all the stops, and last year was the most substantial drawdowns on national reserves in the history of Singapore. And the government makes the point that, look, that this is precisely the rainy day these reserves were meant to serve. And so the use of national reserves to support the COVID-19 recovery measures was something which had unanimous support, both sides of the House and the nation as a whole. The net effect of it has been, I think you will find that Singapore was restored to near normality in terms of how we were dealing with ourselves, with each other, going out patterns, going to work patterns. I think we were quite considerably less affected by COVID compared to our neighbors and other countries in Asia. It's only the travel restrictions that hit everyone badly, but overall, I think, you know, we've been very, very fortunate to have a government that has acted prudently, but also decisively to stabilize the economy by providing the necessary fiscal measures to keep our economy going. So that's where we are at in Singapore.
Thank you, Abraham. Maybe now we go to China, big, huge economy. Sean?
Thank you, Kun. Thank you for that. And I'm very happy to share some thoughts from the ground here. I feel that COVID-19 has really impacted Hong Kong, where I'm at right now, in a very big way. Least of all because SARS happened in Hong Kong almost 20 years ago. So a lot of what we're seeing in COVID is, some say it's a repetition of that, but it's actually much worse in a couple of different ways. The unemployment rate out in Hong Kong is at a 16-year high at 7%. So when I talk through these relief measures, I obviously want to contrast the situation on the ground in Hong Kong, as they are sort of directing different routes, to sort of remedy different issues, but also to contrast that with mainland China, right, which Hong Kong is a part of, and you can see the differences or some of the variations When we talk about relief measures, we talk about economic stimulus, but more importantly, monitoring, right? Sort of fraud control and issues of the like. We just had a budget in Hong Kong last week. So a lot of this is very new, very happy to share this with the group. But when you look at the, if I sort of categorize them into three main buckets for relief measures, I think they're really sort of focused on three different routes. The cash payout scheme, which you see on the slide, is really the one that goes straight to permanent residents of Hong Kong, age 18 and above. It's 10,000 Hong Kong dollars per person, and this came into effect sometime last year. And so, to date, about 6.5 million people have received this, as a direct relief measure from the government. The second measure doesn't go to employees, it really goes to employers. It's part of the anti-epidemic fund, right, under the Economic Employment Support Scheme in Hong Kong to provide time-limited financial support to employers so that they can retain their employees to sort of stop the slide in the unemployment rate. So employers participating in the mandatory provident fund and self-employed people are eligible to apply for this scheme. It's broken up into tranches. The first tranche with an amount of 25.5 billion Hong Kong dollars had covered as many as 100,000 employees, and over 1 million employees have benefited from the scheme. And now a second tranche is being implemented. The obligation is obviously on the employers, right? When they receive this funding, they have to undertake and warrant that they will not implement redundancies during the subsidy period. They have to undertake that they will spend the subsidies wisely, and that they wouldn't spend this all just on paying out the wages to employees. And obviously there are penalties, right? The government would reserve the right to claw back on the subsidies if there are complaints, if there is a large magnitude of redundancies that were being made, because that would defeat the purpose and the object of this payout, which is to retain the employees and to stop the slide in the unemployment rate. The third measure is really sort of targeting sort of the financial viability of SMEs, small, medium enterprises. And as of the end of January, as many as 42.7 billion Hong Kong dollars in loans were approved. And what this really does is it provides enterprises, small, medium-sized enterprises with low interest loans, no interest loans, interest subsidies. It's really to keep these businesses afloat, right? Where they have a special line of funding for employee wages, for rents, and so on. And so I think when you look at the three directions in Hong Kong, it's money to people directly, money to employers to cut the slide in the employment rate, and money to small, medium enterprises in particular, so that they can stay in business during this time. A quick comment on mainland China before we move to the next slide is, I think the support mechanism up in the mainland is really focused more on tax, value-added tax, social security, the infrastructure, departments, banks, paybacks to businesses. And that is obviously a different treatment, right? It's more holistic, it's tax, it's social benefits, it's healthcare and the like. And so that might be a little bit of a difference in approach. But if we go to the next slide, Koon, and we look at the economic measures in place, I think the big one in Hong Kong is the anti-epidemic fund. It's a very big amount of money. This came out in last week's budget, and it deals with, of course, the employment support scheme I talked about. But it also has very targeted relief measures for specific industries that are particularly hard hit by COVID. Tourism, flight, aviation, food and beverage, retail, entertainment. And I think that, it's a combination, right, of a lot of funding for the entire population, but also very targeted funding for areas that the government believes is particularly hard hit by the circumstances. So I won't go into detail on this, but I do think that part of the budget, part of the plan for the next 12 months is really going to be on, supporting the infrastructure, right? We are talking about distance business program as a new initiative for enterprises to really take advantage of this chance to build up an IT infrastructure. For those of you that have come to Hong Kong, you could see that everything is still very much in a cash society and not so much an e-mobile payment, e-commerce society. And so I feel, instead of working on matters out here, that a lot of the funding is now tied to electronically, making things in a convenient way, right? We now have $5,000 in e-coupons for residents under the new budget that would be part of the stimulus. And again, if you contrast that with mainland, a lot of the funding is really going into tax reduction, and the whole infrastructure by contrast. So that's really the difference in stimulus. My next slide is just a very quick mention on the monitoring, right? Controls against fraud and abuse. And I know we'll talk about this in detail in a couple of minutes, but we have a special anti-epidemic fund steering committee in Hong Kong that is newly created to oversee the implementation of the measures and the use of the fund. As you can imagine, there are dissenting voices in the society as to where the fund should go, what it should be used for, as well as the supervision of this fund. Hong Kong obviously has a very big budget, but sort of supervising that, building in the right controls. There are instances of fraud from time to time, and that is obviously linked to employees, employment, and we'll go into that into detail in the later part of this session. But I again, just to put the contrast in place, up in the mainland, a lot of the existing authorities, the Audit Office, the State Administration of Taxation, the PBOC, those are the ones that are tasked with the controls, really as a function of how the funding is being dispensed, right? To individuals, to businesses versus tax reduction, preferential terms for loans. I think the way the funding and the relief is being implemented would really dictate the way the controls are being put upon that. I'll leave it as that.
Thank you, Sean. Now maybe I'll share a little bit on Malaysia. We're next to Singapore, but we don't have such a big budget. As you can see, the first line of my slide, the program that we had last year for 6 months, the total was ringgit Malaysia 35 billion. That comes to less than 10 billion US dollars. That's the funding that we have. But basically, COVID hit us around March quite badly, and that's when our movement control order came into place. So that's when these started, and the government has actually reacted very quickly to assist and come up with many plans for this. So the plan that was in place, we call it Penjana, and it consists of about 40 different initiatives, basically to help on recovery, basically with the aim to empower the people, to propel business and to stimulate the economy. It's a mixed bag of initiatives, and I'll just give some examples later on. It's both cash as well as non-cash initiatives. So they can be actual payout of funds, there can be forgiveness of debts, there can be basically benefits in kind in terms of travel, in terms of internet connectivity, free internet connectivity. So it comes in a mixed bag of things. So that was the main scheme that we had for last year. The scheme was meant to run from June to December of 2020 for 6 months. And as it is actually not wholly a cash payment thing. One of the central key point of our Penjana scheme is actually a piece of legislation that we call Temporary Measures for Reducing the Impact of Coronavirus Disease Act, very long act, 2020, which was passed in October 2020. Basically, it's non-financial. It aims to provide temporary relief to reduce the impact of COVID through court cases, extension of limitation, prohibition of taking action, prohibition of evicting your tenants, and things like that. Basically, protection by law, longer periods for insolvency, higher limits for taking insolvency actions, things like that to basically stop things from going downhill. That's a very important area of our, one of our relief program. I think at the time when it was actually promulgated or decided, maybe they didn't expect that this to last as long as it does and that we are still here today. Most of the measures were supposed to end in December of last year, but it has now been extended to March, some of them for 2 years. So, you know, it comes as how the situation develops, the Act may have to follow up with that. And recently, just in January of this year, because the Penjana scheme was meant to run for only 6 months, there's the new Permai scheme, which has come into place, which is actually very much an extension of the Penjana scheme last year. Amount is much lower than the amount that is involved is much lower than last year. In terms, it's only 15 billion ringgit. That's about $4 billion US. A huge portion of that goes to purchase of vaccine, setting up the vaccination system that we have to do it. All Malaysians will get free vaccine eventually. So this is part of the Permai scheme that we have on this. As you can see, again, we like to have all these objectives and things. It is intended to combat the COVID-19 outbreak very clearly. It's to safeguard the welfare of people and to support the business continuity for Malaysia. So these are the key schemes. Just very shortly, the key initiatives. One of the biggest initiatives that we have is actually, you can see the first 3 of them: wage subsidy program, hiring incentive, reskilling and upskilling program. It is very much trying to maintain employment, keep workers working by subsidizing employees. So you will get 600 ringgit, USD 150 a month per employee to keep the employee working. Unfortunately, because of limited funding, it's not perpetual. Most of these fundings are actually for a period of 3 months only when it was first started. So you get it for 3 months or 6 months, depending. And then after that, depending on whether there is still money, they will pay or not pay. That's why there is a new scheme that comes up. But the key emphasis on the first 3 is actually maintaining jobs and maintaining people in employment so that, you know, we keep the economy going. And then there are others, as I've said, the non-cash ones, where we can sign up for free internet for the day. Between certain hours, you get 1 gigabyte of internet free. There is also financing for you at special rates. Of course, the tourism sector has also got a lot of support because basically everything has granted to a halt. And all these other smaller schemes, these are just the top 10 schemes that we have. There are many other smaller ones, as I've said, you know, small amounts to provide for free travel and things like that. So that's basically the initiative that we have had. We've not really had very much direct payment to our citizens. Malaysia has always had the scheme whereby the B40, the lowest, the below 40% of the poorest people, they've always had some sort of financial assistance even before COVID came about. So during this time, that has continued basically for financial support for what we call a B40 group of citizens here. That's the initiative that I have for Malaysia. And later we can always discuss more on this thing. Maybe now we can move on to India for Anush. You can share with us. Anush, you are on mute.
perpetual problem on these Zoom meetings. You start talking and you don't realize you're on mute. But thank you for that, Poon. Good to see the initiatives from the other parts of the region, which are obviously very thought through and sort of reflect the concern that the governments have shown in these areas for various aspects of society. India, always a different story, much larger, the largest in the region, in fact, next to China, and the population, the levels of connectivity, employment, various types of business, formal, informal employment. So we really had a mammoth task to deal with, and have we done it all? Well, the house is open on that, but have we done more than what we expected? Likely, yes. So again, we were quite late to the pandemic in that sense. Our March numbers were quite low, but the government braced up quite fast. And even when we had under 1,000 cases countrywide, I think we were in a very, very serious lockdown. And partly that was being done to sort of ramp up healthcare and availability of resources to deal with the pandemic, because it was going to spread given the global experience that India had seen. But the initial days of the pandemic created a pandemonium in that sense, because the lockdown resulted in people being confused, industries and manufacturing across the country shut down towards probably early March. And this was full lockdown, and only essential services industries and those that had to operate, because stagnation would have caused problems, were allowed to operate. And that's where we started seeing the first spillover, because India has a vast amount of informal labor force, those who are contract labor, who have day-to-day wages. And without jobs, they had no place to stay in the city because they are all temporary workers. So our first real brush in assessing a relief program was with the employees or the informal labor workforce that serves the whole country. Suddenly they were all on the road. There was no transport. Borders were shut. So I think the government started reacting to that first. And while the details are all on the screen, I think through the year, what we've seen is social initiatives. So you've seen the government step in and help people below the poverty line in providing funding to purchase essential supplies. So here we are talking about daily food, toothpastes. We are talking about basic amenities to cook, because if the income goes for this strata of employees, they don't even have a daily wage to pay them. So what was interesting was, we have various pre-existing schemes which deal with direct transfer of benefits. So those schemes broadly were, sort of reinforced with additional funding and frequency of transfer to take care of those who were most badly affected, which is a certain section of society which was pretty much suddenly unemployed. So there were a host of those social initiatives. Then obviously acknowledging that trade and industry is also getting affected in a country like ours. A lot of efforts like the ones you see on the screen were brought about to safeguard the interests of the micro, small and medium enterprises. This was in the form of considerable equity support, other forms of equity infusion. We had incentives for lowering tax at source deductions for those that were eligible. And we also increased the budget allocation for health and well-being, apart from, like I heard from the other regional updates, providing loan moratoriums to applicable beneficiaries across the country. So we did see a slew of measures which were targeted at the poorer sections of the society and those for trade and commerce. Obviously, the government also stepped in and got into elements of price control of sanitizers and other life essential medicines. I'll speak about that in a bit. But interestingly, the federal structure played out quite well, because in our country, for those who don't know, we have a central government which may not be the same as the various states that we have. And usually that's a point of sort of disconnect in how funding and relief measures flow. But I think we saw a lot of cohesion between the federal government and the state governments, and the states were provided additional funding from the central government to deal with the crisis, because it was unprecedented and everyone was sort of caught by surprise. So we saw a lot of cooperation between the state governments and the central government, and across board significant packages were floated. And I think what we also noticed, which is again, as the situation was unique, the reaction was also unique. We were seeing the government reassessing their stand on a lot of these measures, and not, having announced them at the beginning of the lockdown, they were revisiting the situation, extending the moratoriums, increasing the funding when necessary. So I think at a very high level, and we can sort of move on to the next slide, we saw a lot of effort that the government took across these various affected parts of society, and from their perspective tried to do a lot. But I guess, given the size of the country and the population, whether it was enough, the house is open on that. We also saw, and I would bother Koen to move to the next slide, a lot of interesting controls that came about. We saw companies trying to cash in on the situation and portraying false and misleading advertisements of products, showing that their products likely would provide immunity from the COVID-19 disease. So we saw the government set up a central consumer protection authority to deal with these misleading advertisements, focusing on the COVID-19 situation. Because people were displaced, to allow them access to public distribution of food, we moved to a one nation, one card system, where anywhere across the country, if you're eligible for public distribution, you could avail of the benefit rather than just being restricted because people were stranded in different parts of the country. We also ramped up efforts to initiate actions for illegal immunity drugs that started getting floated, offering solutions or cures for the COVID-19 situation. So there was a lot that happened in that sense, and the government tried to plug and play wherever it could, given the demands of the situation. And we saw a lot of movement to that extent in the government trying to deal with various aspects of the pandemic. In fact, on the next slide, you would also see that control rooms, dedicated control rooms, were set up for people to address wage-related grievances, because there was also a moratorium on employers from terminating employment if people were not being able to come due to the lockdown, and also a freeze on reduction of salaries. So to address grievances of this category of workforce, there were control rooms set up. Also, states constituted small task forces to ensure timely implementation of the COVID-19 response activities, and also to facilitate the issues being faced by the industry. Various control rooms were set up under the various industry bodies to ensure that supply chain issues, internal trade, logistics of essential commodities do not get affected. So I think the machinery and the government worked immensely hard. And we had a bad wave between say August to December, but before that and currently the cases seem to be in control. So not only in trying to address the impact, but also to contain the virus, I think the government did a fairly robust job in comparison. So that's the India update, and we'll speak more later. Thank you, Koen.
Thank you, Anush. I think we just have one more position in the UK before we move on to a quick panel discussion, and then you can ask your questions in the chat. There's a chat function, and then we will have a quick Q&A at the end after that, about 10 minutes. Roger?
Yeah, thank you. And Koen, would you be able to move it on to the UK slide? Thanks, yeah. So rather like the other speakers in the UK, there have been a huge number of COVID support initiatives. They say at least until yesterday's budget, 150, probably another 15 or so announced yesterday. I'm really going to concentrate on those that are the biggest targets for fraud. So I won't talk about things like the reform of the insolvency regime to protect companies from being put into bankruptcy, or schemes to protect tenants from eviction, which we've heard about as well, having been adopted in other countries. And I expect the schemes I'm going to talk about really are quite similar to schemes in other countries, but we started in March 2020 when we had a sort of, like most of Europe, we shut down face-to-face business in the UK completely in March last year, and that obviously impacted things like hospitality business, airline business, etc. And the government initially introduced a scheme to support large businesses, whereby they would guarantee the loans from lenders to those businesses, from the commercial lenders to those businesses, and a separate scheme for small and medium-sized enterprises, where the government would facilitate for commercial lenders to advance up to 5 million in loans to support those small businesses through the lockdown. However, the small businesses scheme initially introduced didn't work because the paperwork was too much, really, and the decision makings, etc., around it were too slow. So in May 2020, they introduced the bounce back loan scheme, which was specifically aimed at small and medium-sized enterprises, and was intended to get money to those enterprises within 48 hours of the applications. And the applications were, although they required things like details of turnover, details of number of staff, then there was no independent verification of that. The owner of the business just self-certified that the information was true, and they got the money. And that scheme is really probably the principal loan scheme going on today. It's just been extended, I think, for another few months, but obviously because of the self-certification and the speed of dispersal of funds, it's been an obvious target for fraud. If I could then just move on to the next slide. Then there have been initiatives for people who would otherwise have been laid off or made unemployed, and these support schemes have been really about advancing money to the employers, so that the employers can continue to pay the salary of people who are what we call furloughed, or in effect suspended rather than made redundant. So the issue really there has been around the opportunity for employers to defraud the government by taking money and not passing it on to employees, etc. And a little later, there was a concern about self-employed people, so there was a separate scheme for self-employed people where they had to produce evidence of their trading profits, and they would then get $2,500 a month for not being able to earn money during the lockdowns. And just one particular UK scheme, I don't know whether anyone else did this. When we came out of our first lockdown last summer, then the government was very keen to encourage people to go back and stimulate the hospitality, the entertainment and hospitality industry back into business. So for August last year, they introduced what they called the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which meant that you got a 50% discount on a meal in a restaurant if you went, I think, between Monday and Thursday, with a maximum of £10 discount per head. Well, that was probably, in retrospect, a complete disaster as a scheme, because firstly, it encouraged lots of mixing in restaurants, which was not great. It encouraged people to eat too much, and we read today that the survey shows that the high death rates in places like the US and the UK correlate very strongly with obesity in our populations. And thirdly, because you claim the restaurant got the money if you ate in, but didn't get the money if you did a takeaway, it sort of encouraged people on a path to fraud by saying, well, actually, I'll have this meal in, and then as soon as it came to the table, taking it out so that it cost them half as much as it would have cost them as a takeaway. But that was just an interesting example of something that was meant to get people back in, get the economy back going again, but in retrospect, didn't help. So in the next slide, I'll just mention the amounts involved, but they're probably quite large per head of population compared with, for example, Malaysia, more in line with Switzerland. So the bounce back loan scheme, 45 billion was advanced in 6 months. And under these loan schemes, our National Audit Office has said that it will have to write off 31 billion out of 45 billion plus loans. Huge write-off level. Quite a lot of that, though, will be down to credit defaults rather than fraud. 10 million people have claimed have been subject to furlough allowances, with nearly 50 billion sterling going out on that. And then the eat out, the 1 month of being able to eat out at half price, 160 million meals, 850 million pounds. So not too much of an investment in what proved to be a disaster. But that completes that bit.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Roger, and to all of you. I think we have half an hour left for our panel, and for some Q&A at the end. So I think Koen, you can switch off the slides. Yeah, great.
Got it.
Great.
Right, okay. Maybe we will go straight into the discussion, basically, of how people have been abusing the system. Maybe we just start with the first basic question. It's been almost a year since many of these schemes have been launched, and we've heard of all these schemes and disbursed. How active have your authorities been policing these aids, that these aids have been properly utilized? Maybe I'll start with Singapore, because I know you're very good at enforcement.
One of the things that we have managed to do in Singapore on the recommendation of the Public Accounts Select Committee is to set up an inter-agency budget implementation committee, which is chaired by the permanent secretaries from the various ministries, and in particular the Ministry of Finance and Social and Family Development, to oversee the whole of government coordination and implementation of these schemes. So what they do is they've been providing guidance to agencies to ensure that the relief funds are reaching the targeted group, and at the same time to ensure that there is no misapplication of funds or fraudulent misdirection of the funds. And in this regard, they have actually set up in Singapore a grants governance office in October 2019 to coordinate efforts across ministries to implement a new, what we call a grants governance framework to ensure proper financial governance and strengthen grant administration. One of the interesting things that they are doing is this: the Ministry of Finance, together with our white-collar police department, known as the Commercial Affairs Department, they are now seeking to identify potential fraud areas and recommend measures to mitigate fraud risk. And they are relying on technology to carry out pre-disbursement checks as well as post-disbursement data analytics and audit checks to identify potential fraud, abuse, and conflicts of interest. So it's obviously an emerging field of study for us, but the use of data analytics has proven to be very effective 2-3 years ago, when the government was able to uncover a criminal enterprise that was seeking to abuse government grants for upskilling or reskilling of Singaporean workers to the tune of $40 million, all through the use of technology and data analytics. So that's some of the measures that we are using in Singapore.
Yeah, we know that, nothing much gets past the Singapore government. How about bigger jurisdictions like India and China, Hong Kong?
So India has no special sort of task force apart from the ones I just outlined, which have been specifically created to curb misleading advertisements or to initiate actions if they find that illegal drugs are being offered to find a corona cure. But really to check the transfer of the benefits and the schemes, that there hasn't been much. Actually, it's always reactionary here. So if someone is not granted the benefit, he litigates it, and and courts get involved. So we've seen some litigation around that. But if you're a beneficiary of a scheme which is COVID-19 related, apart from the initial KYC around getting it, there's really been no implementation or check as such. I think that audit will start because we have a financial year which is March to April. So I think now given that that's coming to an end, and a lot of these benefits that people took through the year will start getting audited in that sense. Maybe we see that activity come now, but nothing specific that's been created to monitor.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Sean, who are the agencies in Hong Kong who are looking into these abuses? Are these regular prosecution authorities, or are there any special agencies that have been created for that purpose?
Well, it's different in Hong Kong and in mainland China. I think, as I was sharing with the group about how this funding and relief is being dispensed, back in mainland, I think this is sort of done through tax relief, social security contributions. So that's really sort of a government agency to agency type mechanic. No real room for fraud or abuse of process there. In that it's really part of the larger ecosystem. But to your question, Simone, in Hong Kong, the agency that has been set up is a special agency called the Anti-Epidemic Fund Steering Committee. And what it does is it oversees the implementation of the measures and the use of the anti-epidemic fund. And theoretically, right, written to its powers, abuse, fraud, misuse of the funds will be a criminal liability. And the way this is going to be investigated is it could be referred to, by the steering committee to the police force, to the Department of Justice. And if we look back in the past 6 months, there have been some cases. I'm happy to share with the group. I think this is public knowledge. Back in September of 2020, I think as many as 15 people were charged with fraud. What they had done was basically grouped together and they had made applications to acquire $3.87 million worth of anti-epidemic fund. That's Hong Kong dollars. So that's about $500,000 US, of which as much as 240,000 Hong Kong dollars was granted. So they had falsified documents. They had grouped together 38 retail shops, 9 beauty salons as part of their applications. And so during these months, 9 persons were charged with fraud, 20 applications, shops, beauty salons, and etc. And so that's one of the first cases we've seen where the steering committee had made a referral to the police and the Department of Justice. And I think this trend is going to continue.
Great, that's very interesting. In Switzerland, as of the end of February, we had 781 criminal complaints for a total of more or less 100 million US dollars, and 44 of these cases have been closed by a conviction. So we are still at the beginning of this whole process. And so many of these cases relate to companies who paid out dividends despite them having received a loan, and there was a prohibition to pay out dividends when you applied for the loan for a certain time period. And so yeah, and what about Malaysia, Koen?
I think we are quite slow in the game in this thing. There have been complaints made. There is no specific entity that you complain to. So it's the police, the Inland Revenue, our social security, people that. But basically, there have been complaints made. Amounts have been very small. But I think we've so far, from what I can see, we've only really had 2 or 3 arrests of people who have misused the fund. And it's mainly the wage subsidy program. That's the one where you can actually just key in your details online and then the funds will come to you literally within a month. So there's no check on that. So now's the time they're actually catching up to see people who have put in fraudulent details of how many people they have and things like that. So there's been 2 cases in February. It's only on an arrest stage, so no prosecution yet. They're still doing investigations. Yeah, so maybe we move on to the next one. So Roger, you have been practicing for such a long time in this area, as I've indicated earlier. What sort of abuses have you seen in this recent?
I'm sorry, Koen, I'm actually.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Can you just repeat it?
Yeah. So, what sort of abuses have you been seeing arising from all these schemes here? Are they something that are new, or is it just new things that are coming out, or just existing people trying to just defraud? Things that apply. And also in particular in the UK, I think there's a lot of public shaming of people who have actually gotten, funds to furlough, as you said, employees, and then they don't deserve it. And I think I've also read about people who have actually been returning funds that they have taken.
Yeah. So very interesting to see the wide coverage. I mean, just starting with your last point about the public shaming, I suppose particularly when the furlough scheme was first available, then businesses didn't really know what the impact of the pandemic was going to be on them, and it was clear across, particularly service businesses, that they no longer needed quite a few of the staff that they had when they had offices. So law firms no longer needed receptionists and people to organise events, face-to-face conferences, etc. And so quite a few professional services firms did actually furlough or put their staff on the scheme, whereby the government paid 80% of their wages, not for lawyers really, or for the actual fee-earning professionals. And then you also saw, I think, with what you will have seen in Malaysia is the stories about the big football clubs furloughing their staff, and then with the football clubs there was a sort of shaming thing. Well, if your football players are being paid 200 million a year, then really you shouldn't be, if you can pay them that, you shouldn't be claiming for furloughing the staff. So I think that they had to some of them reverse their policies. And I think for the professional services firms, then actually a few months in, they realized that their revenues were going up rather than down as a result of the pandemic. And so it became embarrassing for them to be seen, reputationally embarrassing to be claiming public funds. But in terms of fraud, I mean, I suppose sort of key points here really, then it was obviously the pressure from the government to get money out to people quickly in need, quickly, was such a huge opportunity that the organized crime gangs moved in. They set up fake companies, etc. Our AML system did actually reject 27,000 applications for loans on the basis of fraudulent applications and saved $1 billion that way. But obviously lots went out. But I don't think that the fraud is really going to be pursued seriously until the time comes to repay the loans, and which is not yet. That's when people will start realizing that the borrower was a fraudster rather than a company in genuine need. And so at the moment, I think the enforcement we've seen is around a few high-profile arrests and charges. So within one financial institution in London, they arrested 3 people who were creating fake applications to that bank to get loans from that bank, which was supported by the government. And we've seen quite a few people arrested in relation to claiming for employees laid off who were actually still working, etc.
Is there anyone else who would like to share what they have seen?
I think we may get the Innovative Fraud of the Year award on the basis of this. We've generally seen an increase in the online frauds, but we had a gentleman who portrayed himself as wanting to sell the Statue of Liberty for $4 billion, and that the proceeds would go to a state government in India for coronavirus funds. That got just caught before the gavel rang on the sale. So yeah, we've seen a lot of that. The online frauds have definitely increased. I think everyone, because there was a lot of shift to pursuing transfers online, and we, like some countries, we also had our own national app, which you had to download if you have to go to offices, travel, just to show if you've been exposed or if you've been tested positive. So a lot of online fraudsters started attacking that app to steal identities. But this personal example that I came across, where someone tried to sell the Statue of Liberty, really hit the high innovation on the COVID frauds that we saw here.
Okay. Sean, maybe?
Sure. No, I echo that, and I see that we have a question, in the Q&A box.
Yes. Does anybody want to take this?
I mean,
Does the panel have advice for state-owned enterprises intending to make international investments, particularly where the state-owned enterprise receives direct state support or where the assets are considered sensitive? So I think the question comes from India. So maybe Anush, are you able to answer this question?
It's actually mine and Roger's common friend from Malaysia who's raised this question. Lakshmi.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. We should answer that live. So, I mean, if I'd understood the question correctly, if there are if there's a state-owned enterprise looking to invest and it's in receipt of funds, I would do a more active diligence these days compared to even before, depending on where the funds are being used and which industry they're going into. So and I've seen that. I think a lot of our transaction colleagues have been very active in doing the ABC diligence more stricter now into incoming investment, and coming from a state-owned enterprise, whether a fund or an infrastructure company. I've seen a more robust diligence than in the past. So that would be my advice, that you need to probably look at diligence in a more way. But that's if I've understood the question correctly. Lakshmi, please feel free to correct if the tenor of the question was different.
Maybe I could share a perspective as well. The economy in China is filled with state-owned enterprises. It's a very big command economy, so to speak. And in my work, I have served as the independent monitor for some of these state-owned enterprises, as they detect fraud, whistleblowing and the like. And I think particularly when dispensing cross-border, investments, right, across Southeast Asia, Central Asia, perhaps part of its Belt and Road Initiative that's really spanning across half the globe. And I have seen a lot of state-owned enterprises in China sort of focus on specific diligence when it comes to funds, right? Funds to offshore accounts, funds to parties that are on sanction lists, sort of red lists and the like. And I think, obviously it is an evolving trend, but I am seeing a lot more emphasis on state-owned enterprises, being responsible, being cognizant, not only of domestic local requirements and restrictions, but, the Interpol list, the red list, the US sanctions list, for example. I think these are things that are slowly making its way into best practices for state-owned enterprises in Asia.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think reputationally the world has changed. I think also for state-owned enterprises investing abroad, in that my sense is that many countries are more sensitive to providing financial support for businesses in their countries that may be owned by foreign states. So, for example, international airlines, etc. When they that I think there's a much more an expectation that the state-owned investor won't expect their investee company in, say, the UK to draw on the UK support for businesses when the airline is hit by COVID troubles.
Okay. Any further questions? No one raising hands. So maybe maybe Koen, would you like to share what kind of abuses there have been in Malaysia?
Am I on? Yes, I'm not on mute. Basically, in Malaysia, most of the fraud, I would say, are small time. The amount involved are quite small. I mean, of course, they can accumulate. Like I said, the 2 arrests that have been taking place were actually claiming for wage subsidy. They were claiming for more employees than they have. As I've said, each employee is only getting a subsidy of about USD 150 a month, and for a maximum of 3 months. So the amount that you're looking at is like $500 US dollars per person. So, but you could claim 100 and then the amount just increases. So those are actually the type of fraud that we have on that thing. At this point in time, we haven't seen a lot of huge schemes or, any of these big schemes that have been perpetrated to get money. Because in Malaysia, there are not that many of these big, huge payouts. They're all really small time things.
I think what in Switzerland, it would be interesting to see how these cases will be handled, because as I mentioned before, there have been very little controls. I mean, the goal of the government was really to distribute help quickly, so you could apply very easily for a quite substantial loan without there being like massive controls. And in Switzerland, let's say, for someone to be indicted for fraud, you need a certain, let's say, scheme of lies, or you need to use forged documents. So you really need, let's say, an element of deception of the other party. And I would be quite interested in seeing how the courts will deal with that if someone just applies and there is no checks, because for someone to be guilty of fraud, the other party must have at least conducted some minimal checks to verify whether what was presented to it could be untrue. So I don't know whether there are similar positions in other jurisdictions. Maybe Roger, what is the position in the UK if someone just presents a case and the other party does not check whether whether it is correct or not.
Well, yeah, I suppose it's sufficient in terms of criminal liability, I think, to make a false representation for your own financial gain. So probably you don't. I should know this, but you probably don't need to prove that the person who paid out was tricked.
Okay.
But for civil recovery claims, then you have to show reliance on the representation.
Okay. Yeah. So different position.
Yeah, I've had a look at the applications in Malaysia, and usually there's a little box at the bottom where you have to tick your declaration that everything that you have given to them is true and nothing but the truth.
In Singapore, we had this interesting phenomena where the Minister for Social and Family Development warned people about making fraudulent claims and gave a moratorium for people to own up. And believe it or not, more than 500 people returned the $500 that they had obtained, improperly. And the minister made a statement that even though they may have technically committed an offense, the authorities were unlikely to take action against those who return the funds. We've also had situations where about 1,000 people were detected to have made erroneous declarations, and they were asked to return the grant payments that they had received. And 1,000 people out of 200,000 recipients, that's about 0.5% of such cases. And I think given the novelty of the grants and the general circumstances that we found ourselves in, I think in this instance, the government had chosen to take a soft touch approach, simply asking for the return of these funds. I believe all, if not most of it, had been effectively returned. So that's been the general approach taken in Singapore. It's a light touch, pre-warning approach. There has been, of course, one or two more egregious cases where individuals have sought to make phantom claims for up to 8 different people. In one particularly egregious case, the person was sentenced to 5 months jail. Again, in Singapore, it's quite a confusion model where you pick up 1 or 2 cases and punish them really severely, and everybody else sort of falls into line. But by and large, you can see the government's general approach has been a soft touch, which, if you understand how Singapore culture works, can be quite effective.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a unique jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think we are coming to an end of this panel, unless there are any further questions. And yes, I think we can share the slides. We will check that with the IPBA. We also understand that a recording of the session will be put on the website in due course. So it was great to have you all. Thanks a lot for your interesting contributions, and thanks a lot to the attendees who have stayed until the end. And it would be very interesting to hear in a year's time what has happened in between, because I think we are at the beginning of something that will further develop. Yeah. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon again. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.